What made you finally make the leap from short stories to your first novel?
Not knowing what I was doing. That's how it happened. I honestly, I did not intend to write the novel. I'm often told that the story makes them cry. I feel like that could be good or bad. I feel that, yes, it is a sentimental novel in many ways, but I feel like it's earned every bit of that these are real characters living real lives. And in those lives, there's happiness and there's sadness. So I feel like it's authentic.
Welcome into today's episode of Connecting Kansas City, where we are joined by Paul Lamb. Born in Kansas City, Paul Lamb went astray for a couple of decades, but returned here more than 30 years ago to raise his family. He now lives and writes in Overland Park, except when he escapes to his cabin in the Ozarks. The author of nearly 50 published short stories, his debut novel, One Match Fire, takes place in Kansas City, St. Louis, and, of course, a cabin in the Ozarks. Paul, thank you for being here today. I appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thanks for having me on.
And congratulations on the novel. After so many short stories, what made you finally make the leap from short stories to your first novel?
Not knowing what I was doing. That's how it happened. I honestly, I did not intend to write the novel. I wrote a single short story about a cabin in the woods. And the man has to sell his father's beloved cabin to pay for his father's medical bills. And he's gone out there and he's struggling with this fact. And I wrote that story. I was pleased with it. It got published. I thought, that's fine. But then I thought, I sure know the setting really well, and I sure know these characters really well. I wonder if they have any other stories in them. So I wrote a few more. Most of them got published, and I wrote a few more. And I started thinking, I seem to have accumulated something here. And a common aspect is this cabin in the woods. And it turned out the relationships between fathers and sons. So I showed it all to a friend of mine, a writer friend. And I said, I think I have a story cycle I'm working on here. And he said, no, you don't. You have a novel. And the sooner you treat it like a novel, the better it will be. And so once I had that understanding, I finished it as a novel. So that's how it happened.
How many, what time frame did all this evolution take place across?
Oh, the embarrassing number is 10 years. It was probably 7 years of just writing these stories, these and other stories that were not related to it, before I had that epiphany about it being a unit, a whole novel. So then it was 3 years of action.
I've heard so many writers talk about how grueling the writing process is, writing a book. Was it worse than you anticipated, or since you had written so many short stories, were you ready for it when the time came?
This one wasn't grueling. The chapters are all effectively standalone stories. Each chapter could be read as a complete whole. They happen in sequence across 3 generations of lives, but it was just short stories I was writing. I had some facility with that, so it wasn't so very hard. Now, when it came time to pull it all together, I had to look at it with a much bigger perspective. And, I don't have anything about him being in middle school, and I don't have anything about parent-teacher night. That should be in there. And so then I had to fill in a lot of gaps. And that was more work than I started out intending to do. But it came together.
Yeah. What percentage of this story is based on your own life?
I do have a cabin in the Ozarks. It's not as grand as the one I depict in the novel. That part is from my life. However, I'm second of 8 children in my family. And as many people will know, that means you get a lot of group attention, big pot meals, that kind of thing. And as a consequence, I never had a close relationship with my father. And I think what I wrote in this novel is what I imagine a close father-son relationship would be. So I guess that's not really from my life.
Mm-hmm. But inspired in a roundabout way. Yeah.
Well, yes, it is. And there are 3 generations. So the grandfather and his son have a very healthy, robust relationship, but the son and then the third character, the grandson, have a very strained and difficult relationship that they may or may not overcome by the end of the novel. You have to read it.
Mm-hmm.
So, everything comes from life, of course, but there is such a thing as poetic license, so you get away with it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So have you been a writer by trade your whole life, or did this start as a hobby, and how did it evolve for you?
Yes, this was a hobby. My mother tells me I was always writing as a child, and I would bring her things I wrote and read them to her. It was a common statement in the household that, "Where's Paul?" "Oh, well, he's up in his room reading." "Oh, well, that makes sense. That's what he does." So I was always bookish. For a long time, I didn't feel like I had the life experience, maybe, to actually write. And I wrote a lot of feature articles for newspapers and magazines. It was all sweetness and light about profiles of business executives or nature, natural history, that kind of thing. Never anything investigative, never any ambush journalism or that sort of thing. So I was writing, but I hadn't started fiction writing until much later, although it's been more than 30 years since my first published short story. So I guess it's all a matter of how you do the math.
Sure. So were you were a journalist for your occupation then, or that was also kind of on the side?
No, that was also freelance and just a hobby. It was a self-esteem thing. I got to do things I wouldn't have otherwise. There was a famous natural history writer who lived down in the Ozarks named Sue Hubble. She would write for the New Yorker, the New York Times, and all of that. And she lived in this little cabin in the Ozark Mountains. And somehow I finagled an invitation to interview her for an article. And I visited her at her cabin, very humble thing. And she kept bees. That was her thing. She was a beekeeper. And I wrote 3 articles from that for the newspapers here in Kansas City, one in St. Louis, and the one in Little Rock. I think at that point, I thought that it was a turning point. Either I needed to pursue this as a career, journalism, or continue to look at it as a hobby. I realized I didn't want to take whatever skills I had and put it in the service of the man. I wanted it to be my thing. So I could write whatever I chose to write about in whatever angle I wanted. So I kept it as a hobby instead of a career. So then I worked in various corporate capacities behind a desk, unimaginative work that paid the bills, which is what you have to do when you have a family.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The first part of my career, I was a sports journalist.
Oh, yes.
So I understand it's a grind, and you've got a lot of money to be made, and you're working really bad hours. Right. And now I have quote unquote a grown-up job, and this is my creative outlet, and social media content creation. So I completely understand. It's very freeing when you get to create just for the sake of creating and not to meet a certain quota or a deadline or whatever. So
yeah, and on your terms. And I think that's why I eventually went into fiction, because everything there is on my terms. I had kept a natural history blog for a while, for 10 years, about my cabin and then the woods around it. And I posted a photograph of a certain butterfly, and I said, "I think this is, such and such, such and such." And boy, did I get burned on that. People wrote in and said, "That is not, it's XYZ, XY." And I thought, well, I'm never going to be an expert in these things, but I can be in the fictional universe that I create. And so that's why I drifted into fiction.
Yeah. But I feel like even writing fiction, sometimes I read novels and I'm like, man, they had to do a lot of research just to build this world and make sure it's accurate. For you setting the novel in the Ozarks where you are so familiar, did you still have to do a lot of research to make sure I'm accurately describing the trees or different things like that? Or did it come pretty naturally to you since you spent a lot of time there?
It came naturally. And I'm also not going to be very precise in my description. At this cabin in the novel, they have oak trees, they have hickory trees, they have redbud trees in the understory, but I don't pull out the Latin names for these things or anything like that. They have some fish in the lake. Well, I think they're bass, and there's some bluegill, I guess. They're not precise about it, and I don't have to be precise about it.
That's probably the way to go, or else you'll have people from every community after you. That's not exactly right.
Right.
It does seem like the Ozarks itself is really as much of a main character here as the family, because it's such a the cabin is such a central piece to the story. How did you come to make that the setting? I guess it made sense from the beginning since you had set your short stories there, but what was it intentional to be like, I want to place this in Missouri and in this place that means so much to me?
If you know the Ozarks, you know there is something alluring, something magical about them. They really call out to the right sort of soul. And so it was obvious that the story was going to have a lot of its important acts take place there. Now, there are some chapters set in Kansas City. There are some in St. Louis. But the important stuff happens at this little cabin. What it serves as is a place that's apart from the rest of their lives. You know, they have their schooling, they have their jobs, they have their relationships in the city. But when they go to the cabin, they're separated from all of that. And they can drop their masks and their persona and be who they are with each other, not face any judgment and be open and solve their problems that they have. So, you know, I get a little flack because these guys, these fathers and sons, go skinny dipping in the lake all the time. And the point of that is it's complete trust. You know, there is no mask on anymore. I'm completely safe with you. You are safe with me. No judgment, that kind of thing. And then at the end of the day, they all sleep in the same bed because they are able to come together at this cabin in ways that they can't in the rest of their lives. So that is the purpose of the cabin. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's nice to go out there and do further research with a fishing pole or a lighting a one-match fire or cutting down a tree, just to make sure I have it right, of course.
Absolutely. We gotta make sure you're accurate. What about the scenes in Kansas City and St. Louis? Have you spent a lot of time in both cities, it sounds like? So that was pretty easy for you too, or did you have to make trips to research there as well?
I was born in Kansas City in the Westport area, but when I was about 2 or 3 years old, we were uprooted and my father took a job in the St. Louis area. So I grew up in St. Louis and came here in my late 20s, I guess, for a job and settled in Overland Park where we raised our 4 kids and so forth. So I knew both places well. The Kansas City scenes are set mostly in Waldo, where this working class family has their good lives together, and in Brookside, where this boy's upper class girlfriend lives. And of course, there's all kinds of tension growing from that. And in St. Louis, they live in a community called Richmond Heights, which is where I had actually lived for a while. And it's also working class, blue collar, starter homes, very respectable. And I lived there, so I knew that. And the scenes are even on the very street that I lived in when I was there. So as far as research goes, a little bit. I have a scene in a subsequent story where the young family have an apartment on the Paseo here in Kansas City. And at first it was going to be on Warwick Boulevard. Or Warwick, I don't know how we pronounce that. And the point was I had to move it because there was a fire station near the apartment. And when they were looking at it to see if they wanted to rent it, a fire truck goes roaring past the house with the lights on and his sirens going. And the little boy is so overjoyed that, fire truck. Oh my gosh. That's what they decide causes them to rent the apartment because it's just joy that brought them there. Well, there isn't a fire station anywhere near an apartment building in Warwick. So I have to move into the Paseo. So that's the kind of research I had to do. Now, that's not in One Match Fire. That's a subsequent story. But that is the kind of thing. And my wife and I would get in the car and drive to Waldo. And there are a number of scenes in Sunnyside Park in Waldo, which has a paved trail, a walking trail that's in a figure 8. And of course, I had to get my running shoes on and give a trot around there to do that kind of research. And there's a McDonald's near there where some scenes take place. And of course, we had to try out the McDonald's and that kind of thing. But it was a benign kind of research. And really, the story takes place in the hearts and minds of the characters. So setting is realistic, but doesn't have to be deep and perfect.
Yeah, that makes sense. That sounds like a fun kind of research. Just hanging out, taking in the energy and the vibes and making sure you're reflecting it accurately. So are there plans for a sequel?
A sequel is written.
Okay.
It follows the third main character, the grandson, in his life. And He, of course, has a son and doesn't get along with his son. So there's the father-son dynamic playing once again. And how was that resolved? And when I was doing the developmental edits with my publisher for One Match Fire, one of the editors said she really wanted to see the novel about the wife of the middle character. So the son, because she's a long-suffering person. And so having never been a woman, I didn't think I could write such a thing, not with any authenticity. But I started, and I finished the first draft this week, and it's 200,000 words, which is too much, far too much. So it'll need a lot of work. So it's actually a trilogy, and I think my publisher is interested in it. So once I polish them up some, I'll submit them, and we'll see where that goes.
So the story about the wife, which time frame is it set in, or does it span all of them?
It's her life story. So it starts when she's in grade school at Visitation Parish, near the plaza in Kansas City, because she lives in Brookside. The story ends in her little house in Richmond Heights in St. Louis. And I wanted to be very careful that I wasn't just telling the boys' story from her point of view, but to tell her story. And the boys will factor into it, of course, because they're her husband and her son and her grandson. But she has a full life of her own. And it's her life isn't justified or explained in terms of the men in her life. Her life is hers. And that's the story I've tried to tell. I'm very aware that I'm not a woman, but I tried to create a character who's true, a real, credible character who happens to be a woman. Now, I'll have beta readers who will tell me a girl would never use that word. My wife even said that once. And what girls really talk about is this. And I'll benefit from that, and I'll revise it as I go.
That's beautiful. Kudos to you for trying and doing that, and centering a story from a woman's perspective, because that was one question I had. As a female reader, I think I'm typically drawn to books with female main characters.
Right.
So it's like you'll expose your whole entire storyline to another demographic by doing that, I think. So that's really neat. Very cool. Are you working on anything else? Any other completely separate storylines for a novel, or are you kind of committed to these characters for now?
I'm captive of these characters. They won't let me go. There's actually a fourth novel I think I could write about them that I'm just not going to. There are other things I want to write and other things I want to work on. I happen to have two other novels that I think are finished, and I have been shopping them around, but I just don't have the mental energy until I'm done with this family.
Sure.
And there are some short stories that have been knocking around in my head for years, and I think I'd like to get to those. So there's no rest.
Yes. Not enough time in the day. Okay, well, one more question before I wrap it up here. Is there anything that you want people to know about your stories, about your book, anything we haven't touched on that you really would like for people to know about your work?
I'm often told that the story makes them cry. I feel like that could be good or bad. I feel that, yes, it is a sentimental novel in many ways, but I feel like it's earned every bit of that these are real characters living real lives. And in those lives, there's happiness and there's sadness. So I feel like it's authentic.
I love that. Okay, last question. This is something I ask everyone that comes on the show. What is a great meal you've had recently in Kansas City? Just went out to dinner somewhere and it knocked your socks off.
I always go back to the Jerusalem Cafe in Westport and have the vegetarian platter. My wife and I share that. Now, I'm not vegetarian, so that must be really good if that is what draws me back there. Now, everything at Jerusalem Cafe is good, but we consistently have that. Love that.
Sounds great. That I have not had that there, so I will have to try it because I could use some vegetables in my life right now. I'm not going to lie. All right, Paul. Well, where can everyone find you on social media, online? Where can they get your book? All that good stuff.
My webpage is paullambwriter.com, and that links to my blog and some notices for interviews such as this one. My crack technical team that updates that for me has a 2-month-old now at home, so they're a little preoccupied, but that'll get updated quickly, I think. The book is available through all the usual outlets, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Bookshop. Any bookstore can order it for a reader. It can also be purchased directly from the publisher, Blue Cedar Press. And that's the best because I get a nickel or two more when it's purchased that way.
Perfect.
But it's available. It's not hard to find. And it's in the Kansas City Library, Johnson County Library, Library of Congress. So it can be borrowed as well.
Amazing. Love that. Paul, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
This was a good time. Thank you.
All right, guys. Thanks for listening. We will see you next time. Thanks so much for joining us today. If we haven't already, let's connect. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Pinterest, LinkedIn, and TikTok at Rach the Realtor KC. We're back right here every Thursday morning with a new guest on Connecting KC. See you next time.